So I'm going to work through a few of the practice problems, primarily from the Quiz 3 practice problems that I think would be good review for the exam. Um, so I'll kind of try to hit on a few things as we kind of move forward. So the first one that I'm going to look at is problem 4, right? So we're thinking about what's going to happen to long run equilibrium prices and then also long run real GDP. Okay. So in problem 4, kind of what we're thinking about is we're in the long run. We're kind of not using this hybrid model. We're like back in module 5. We've got our aggregate demand and we've got our long run aggregate supply. All right, so we're thinking about the long run outcome. So if I have in problem 4, business taxes increase. Okay. So what are the things that we said kind of impact aggregate demand? We went through kind of a list of things. I'll use a few of them here. I'll try to point kind of to all of them, but let's say initially we've kind of got our prices and our real GDP, and they start out here. All right. If I saw a increase in taxes, all right, so we said aggregate demand is going to be how many, it's kind of like our expenditure approach to GDP. So if we have higher taxes, people have less money to spend. So we could think about an increase in taxes is actually going to cause a decrease in our aggregate demand. Okay. So if we see a decrease in aggregate demand, this is going to be a downward shift, okay? Or down to the left, right? It's decreasing, pushing it closer to that point of zero. Okay. So what will the new long run point be? Well, our prices are going to be lower. But notice when we have aggregate demand changes, if long run aggregate supply does not change, our real level of GDP will also not change. So this is where we said any shift in aggregate demand will not change our long run GDP. Okay. Now, so in that case, it would be real GDP stays the same. If prices are lower, we're seeing deflation. Now, what are some other things that could kind of cause this same impact, right? Well, we said, part of aggregate demand was, you know, C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports, right? So let's say that we had a decrease in investments, a decrease in government spending, or a decrease in exports. Those would all cause kind of this leftward shift and would have the same impacts as that tax increase, right? So that tax increase was actually causing consumption to go down. Now, what's something else that could cause could cause our GDP to go down? Well, what would cause aggregate demand to be lower is if actually we had a larger amount of imports, or color doesn't show up as good here. If imports go up, that means that our overall aggregate demand would actually go down. So to kind of have a similar effect of an increase in taxes, we could see an increase in imports or a decrease in investment in fiscal capital, government spending, or exports. Okay. Or we could have something else that shifts our consumption, right? So some of the things that we talked about that shift in consumption. So how would I get a decrease in consumption if I have lower expected future income? We said if exchange rates worsen, oops, sorry, exchange rates. If we saw an increase in real interest rates, because if interest rates are higher, it makes borrowing more costly. We're less likely to borrow money. We have less money to consume. That would actually also cause an aggregate demand decrease. Okay. We also talked about, we already did kind of taxes. We also talked about, if economic conditions worsen, it's essentially the same idea as kind of worsening exchange rates. We talked about What's the other one that I'm forgetting? We got exchange rates, real interest rates, expected future income. Um, Let me see if there's any I had in the slides here. Uh, yeah, that should kind of cover it for us. Um, so those would be kind of other changes that we could see that have the similar impacts on consumption as well. Okay. Now, in problem three, something else we could think about is what's the only thing that's actually going to change cause or change the long run GDP is if we see shifts in our long run aggregate supply. So to make this a little bit more complicated, let's look at a question like problem 5. Okay. So if I'm looking at problem 5, I am given an increase in, what do I want here? There's a long run increase in long run GDP, which of the following would guarantee that this happens? No, I want a simultaneous ones. Here we go. Let's look at problem 6. Sorry, I had the wrong problem there. So in problem 6, we've got an increase in exports. Right? And maybe I'll kind of use this here, red. And then we had which of the following would guarantee, sorry, we had a decrease in our labor supply. Okay. So if these things happen at the same time, what are the impacts going to be? Okay. So I'm starting out. I've got real GDP, got prices, got my aggregate demand, I've got my long run aggregate supply. Okay. So here we're just thinking about the impacts on long run. So I got my GDP and prices start here. If I increase exports, that's going to be a rightward shift or an increase in aggregate demand. So what impacts will that have on my long run prices and my long run GDP? Well, prices go up, right? So here I've got prices are increasing from this increase in exports, but my real GDP doesn't change at all. Okay. Now, if at the same time we had that labor supply decrease, right? So what did that do? We had our original aggregate demand. We had our long run aggregate supply, our initial price, and our initial GDP. If I saw a decrease in labor supply, that was one of the factors of pull, that's going to lower or shift to the left, decrease my long run aggregate supply, in which case my new prices will be higher, but my new long run GDP is going to be lower. So this decrease in my labor supply caused prices to go up in the long run and GDP to go down. So the question says, what's going to happen to long run GDP here if these happen at the same time? Well, this doesn't change GDP. This decreases it. So I know if I'm thinking about the total effect here, GDP would have to go down. Now, what's going to happen to my long run equilibrium prices? Well, they're both pushing price up, so I know that my prices are going to be larger. Okay. Any questions on that one? Sorry, I said any questions. I'm feeling I'm used to in class mode. So the next one that we'll want to look at is what happens. So let's say I have a similar example. So I'm going to do the same increase in exports, but I'm also going to do that education levels go up, right? So we'll kind of start out. We have the same increase in exports. So that increase in exports or maybe economic conditions improve causes prices to go up and no change in my real GDP. Okay. Now, if instead of that labor supply change, we have this increase in education levels, what will happen from that change in the long run. So we've got aggregate demand, we've got long run aggregate supply, and our initial price will be here. Our initial GDP is going to be here. If instead education levels go up, that's going to increase our long run aggregate supply, which will do what? Lower our prices and increase our GDP. So prices are going to be going down, long run GDP will be going up. So if we think about the total effect here, well, GDP, we know if one of them is not changing it, the other is increasing it, we know GDP is going to have to go up. But what's going to happen to prices? Indeterminate, right? The only way I know what happens to prices if I know which of these shifts or which of these effects was larger. So if I were to tell you that that change in exports was greater than the effect caused from that change in education, well, then the effect that dominates will be the effect of that increase in exports. So that was pushing prices up. That overcomes the decrease in prices caused by the change in education, in which case we know that prices would have to go up. Right? If the reverse was true, then we would know education change is kind of dominating. There we would see the long run price go down. Okay. So that wasn't in that problem, but if I had asked you, if I told you, right, which of these effects was larger, you could then tell me what happens to that equilibrium price. If I don't, the answer would be indeterminate. I could also tell you what if the long run change in prices was that it increased, which of these effects must have been larger? You know, it must have been the one that was increasing prices or that change in exports. Okay. Okay. So another question we could work through from quiz number 3, practice problems. And I'll kind of add some stuff in here. So let's think about problem 12. All right, so we've got an increase in taxes. So we'll focus on that part first, and I'll kind of add in some additional questions I could ask you. So we're now thinking about the long run, and we're also thinking about the short run. Okay. So if we've got our real GDP, we've got prices, we said kind of initially, here's my aggregate demand curve. Here's my long run aggregate supply. Here's my short run aggregate supply curve. So the initial price level is right here. The initial level of GDP is right here. Okay. If I have an increase in taxes, that means people have less money to consume products. So I'm going to get an aggregate demand decrease. Okay. Or a shift to the left. So if I think about what impacts this is going to have, right, we're going to think about there's going to be impacts in the short run and there's going to be impacts in the long run. So where does it push my new short run equilibrium? Well, that's where my new aggregate demand hits my aggregate supply curve. So that's going to be right here. This would be my short run price and my short run GDP. So what did it do? It caused my short run price to be lower than it was before, and it causes my short run GDP to also go down. Now, what happens in the long run, right? In the long run, our equilibrium will be where the new aggregate demand hits my long run aggregate supply. So I know that in the long run, prices fall even more, but my GDP compared to the initial point doesn't change. So the only thing that changes long run GDP, once again, are any changes in pull. So I would have to have something that shifts my long run aggregate supply in order to see that long run GDP change at all. So here we would say that this would stay the same. Now in the long run, my price also decreases, right? But it's decreasing by even more. Right? So if we think about what's happening here, the question to 12 was, do I have an inflation or deflationary gap? But I could ask you about what's happening to short run prices or GDP, what's happening to long run prices. So here, I know that my short run GDP is less than my long run GDP, and my short run price is greater than my long run price. So the fact that my prices are going to go down in the future, or that my current GDP is too low, we would call this a recessionary, or we said another term that's synonymous with this would be a deflationary gap. Okay. Excuse me. So we've got a recession or deflationary gap here. What's going to happen in the long run? Well, to move from that short to the long run, prices are going to go down, right? So if we expect that prices are going to be even lower in the future, or we expect there to be some deflation, what companies will currently do is make larger investments, right? So if we think about like a real investment was nominal minus our expected inflation, right, is going to be even lower now. So we're subtracting a smaller amount. Real interest rates go up, higher investment, short run aggregate supply will increase until we get to this long run equilibrium. Okay. So that means there's a deflationary gap and our short run aggregate supply will increase, right, until we get to that long run equilibrium point. Okay. Any questions there before? Oh, I'm back in teaching mode. So let's do another one that I think is a little more difficult. Okay, so let's do a simultaneous change one. So let's do problem 14. Okay. So problem 14, we're thinking about we've got a decrease in job security, while at the same time there's an increase in education or human capital. Okay. So what's going to have to be true? So if we think about here, got my original aggregate demand, got my long run, my short run aggregate supply curve. Okay. So my initial price is right here. My initial GDP is right here. Okay. So when I see this increase in education, what's going to happen, right? I'm going to see a increase in my long run aggregate supply, right? And at the same time, it's shifting my short run aggregate supply curve. Okay. So where will that new equilibrium point be? At a higher level of GDP and a lower price level. Okay. So this is going to happen both in the short and the long run. Okay. So this increase in education, increased long run and short run aggregate supply, which pushes prices down, and my real GDP in the long run to go up. Right? These effects are going to happen in both the short and the long run. Okay. Now, if at the same time, I've got the same kind of setup, start out here. But this problem told us we have a decrease in job security. Well, a decrease in job security is going to do what? It's going to, I don't think I'm going to have a job tomorrow. I don't buy as much today. So we're going to see a decrease in our aggregate demand curve. Okay. Well, what's that going to do? My new short run equilibrium will be right here. Okay. So that's going to cause GDP to go down. Okay. And it's caused my short run prices to also go down. So this decrease in my aggregate demand will cause short run prices to go down and my short run GDP to go down. Well, if GDP is going lower in the short run and my GDP here, my long run GDP is going to be larger, I therefore know my short run GDP is going to have to be less than that GDP in the long run. Okay. So I know that long run GDP will increase, right? I know that long run prices are going to do what? Well, if they're both pushing price down in the short, or where's the long run price going to end up? Down here. So not only is this shift in aggregate demand causing short run prices to go down, the eventual long run prices are going to go down as well, but that long run GDP, the aggregate demand shift, once again, never impacts long run equilibrium GDP. So I know that in the long run, I'm going to see GDP go up. I know that prices are going to go down, right? So we have there GDP will increase in the long run, prices are going to decrease. But what's going to happen to kind of short run GDP? Well, this is pushing short run GDP down. This is pushing short run GDP up. We don't know. Right? We don't know what direction GDP is going to change. It matters the kind of relative size of these shifts. So what's the only way that we get kind of a GDP decrease from the current level, right? It would have to be that that change in aggregate demand was greater than that change in our long run aggregate supply, or the change caused by, I think we had here, was it a decrease in taxes? Nope, decrease in job security would have to be larger than that kind of increase that was caused by education. And that only applies to kind of the short run. Okay. So what would kind of the impact be on short run prices? We know for sure those are going down, but short run GDP, right? Pushing it in opposite directions, indeterminate. We have to know which of those is larger. Now, here's a little bit tricky, right? But if this impact is causing my long run GDP to go up, and this is causing my short run GDP to go down, what will always be the case is that my short run GDP, right, is going to be less than the same graph. I know that my GDP is always going up from this long run supply increase, but if I have a decrease in aggregate demand, doesn't matter if it's really small, and it doesn't matter if it's really large, it's still causing my short run GDP, the point where it hits my new short run aggregate supply curve, to be lower than the eventual long run GDP. So I know that my short run GDP will always be less than my long run GDP. And doesn't matter the size of these shifts. It just matters that aggregate demand is going down. In which case, if my current GDP is too low, we would have a recessionary, or we set a deflationary gap. Okay. So I could ask you any combination of what's happening to long, short run GDP, what's happening to long, short run prices, and then what will exist when we have these simultaneous changes, a recessionary, deflationary gap. I could also do a similar question, but I have an increase in aggregate demand. I have a decrease in longer aggregate supply, any combination of those. Okay. So the next one I want to think about is what if instead I told you that there was only a short run shock and only a kind of something that changed aggregate demand. So this is let's see here. Let's look at question 17. Okay. So in question 17, I've got a short run supply increase. So there must be a positive kind of shock to the economy, or we're in kind of um, positive economic conditions. And then I have an aggregate demand decrease. So on the exam, instead of just telling you, I could give you an example like this. So let's say input prices go down. That's going to be one of the things that we said causes short run aggregate supply to actually go up. I want to produce more units than I was before because they're now relatively cheaper to produce at every single price level. Now, instead of telling you aggregate demand decreases, maybe I tell you that real interest rates are going up, so it's more costly to borrow. I've got an aggregate demand decrease. Okay, so this kind of matches up with the problem, but I'm giving you the reasons why these change. So what's going to happen? Once again, I would probably draw these out separately, and then we'll kind of think about what if they happen at the same time. So I've got GDP, got prices. Say here's our original aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply, initial short run aggregate supply, initial price, initial GDP. And we have kind of the same setup down here. And I'm just going to put these on separate graphs. I think it helps because depending on the relative size of the shifts, drawing them on the same graph might lead you to the incorrect conclusion. Okay. So first of all, before we even look at any of these changes, if I don't see something that changes my long run aggregate supply, I know my new long run GDP will not change, right? So wherever we started out, if there is no shift in my long run aggregate supply, eventually we're going to get back to that same level of GDP. Now, what happens from that input price decrease? Well, that's going to increase our aggregate supply, which does what? It pushes short run GDP to be higher and our short run prices to be lower. Okay, so prices are going down in the short run, GDP is going up. Right? Now, if at the same time we see this aggregate demand decrease, it's kind of similar to the previous problem. What is that going to do in the short run? It's going to cause our prices to go down and our GDP to go down. So we've got this decrease in price and decrease in my short run GDP. Okay. So I think this problem says what's going to happen to short run prices? Well, they're both decreasing price, so we definitely know that prices are going to go down from this simultaneous change. Now, in order to have an inflationary gap, what must be true? All right. Well, one of these is pushing my short-run GDP to be lower. One of these is pushing my short-run GDP to be higher. So if I didn't know, right, if I didn't give you any additional information, I said, what's the total effect? I have a marker that works here. Let's see if we can get this to, there we go. I don't know what's going to happen to my short-run GDP. Okay. I would have to know which of these effects is larger. So if I have an inflationary gap, so that's what I was told in the problem, well, then I know inflationary gap means the current GDP in the short run is actually greater than our long run GDP. So it would have to be the effect that's causing GDP to go up is the one that is larger. So in order to have an inflationary gap, that short run supply shock, right, must actually be greater than, because it's the effect that's kind of dominating, it must be pushing that GDP to increase by more than the aggregate demand decrease is causing it to decrease. So if I have an inflationary gap, I'm given that information. I know that this is going to be true. So I know that my short run GDP must be going up. The only way that's going to occur is if that short run shock has a larger impact than that aggregate demand decrease. Okay. Once again, I could give you different combinations, aggregate demand increases, short run aggregate supply decreases, and you would kind of solve them all in a similar way. Um, but then the second part, or sorry, actually, third part of this question is going to be, let's assume that we have instead a recessionary gap exist. If I have a recessionary gap exist, what is that going to look like? Well, it would have to be that this combination actually led to a GDP that was too low. So I could draw these on the same graph, but all I need to think about here is I know that if I have a recessionary gap, the current level of GDP is too low. So what's going to happen? Well, I know the new long run equilibrium would be right here. So I know that prices must be going down, or if I expect prices to be lower in the future, my expected inflation is lower. That raises real interest rates, making companies more likely to want to invest, increasing my short run aggregate supply until we get to that point where we're now in that long run equilibrium. Okay. So if we had a recessionary gap, we should see that short run aggregate supply increases. So that would be a scenario where that aggregate demand shift was actually larger. If we had, I didn't give you any assumptions and I said, okay, look, assume we have this inflationary gap, right? We start out there instead. Well, then we said we know which of these must have been larger, the short run aggregate supply shift, because it was causing GDP to currently be too high, right? Economic conditions are good. We've got this inflationary gap. Why do we cause it inflationary? Because we know that prices in the long run are still going to return to their old levels. So if we expect there to be increases in prices or expected inflation is higher, that lowers the, excuse me, real interest rate. Companies want to make fewer adjustments, and our short run aggregate supply would actually decrease until we get back to that long run equilibrium point. Okay. So I would know how to kind of solve a question like 17. It might be one that's a little bit more difficult, but this will definitely be something that kind of pops up, or I would expect to see this pop up on the exam. Okay. Any questions there? Or sorry, I keep asking this like I'm not filming it ahead of time. Okay. All right. So mainly worked through module 5 and 6 questions. I want to do a little bit from module 7 here. So I'm going to look at question 5, and I've got this consumption function, which has my autonomous consumption and my marginal propensity to consume. So what we want to think about is here I'm asking you about if the disposable income was 900, what's the current level of savings? Okay. So down here, we're always thinking about these are different values of disposable income, and these are different values of consumption. So if we're spending everything that we earn, a marginal propensity of 1 essentially, and we have no autonomous consumption, consumption is the same as our disposable income. Now we know because we have this autonomous level of consumption and the marginal propensity to consume is not 1, actual consumption will vary from that. So I told you in this problem, assume that the current level of disposable income is 900. What is savings? Well, actual consumption, if we kind of plug this in here, I think we get 1,138. So that's at a disposable income of 900. So if I'm thinking about here, what I could do before I use this graph is savings will always be what? It's going to be my actual disposable income minus what I'm currently actually consuming. So notice in this case, we were given a current level of disposable income of 900. People are spending 1,138. So we get that savings is what? Negative 238. So here to kind of plot this point, I'm thinking about the actual disposable income is less than my actual consumption. I'd be somewhere down here, right? So the actual kind of level of consumption was up here when my disposable income was only 900. So here we have savings that are negative. We would say this is dissavings, right? Any point kind of below the break-even point was we're spending more than we were actually earning. We had dissavings. What about if I asked you as a follow-up question, what would the break-even level of consumption have to be? Less than, greater than 900, we can't determine. Well, here I could just solve for it, but right away I know that it should be something that is greater than 900. Okay. So if I wanted to solve for that break-even level, we said at that break-even level, my disposable income should be exactly equal to my actual consumption. So we can kind of think about this. These two things should be the same. So I could write them both as C. I could write them both as, YD. I know they should be the same. So I do a little bit of algebra here. Subtract this from both sides. All right. I pull the C out front. And I get my actual level of consumption is 400 over 1 minus 0.82, or approximately 2,222. Okay. So sure enough, that value I found was greater than 900. All right. now you a disposable income, ask you to find the break-even level, and then say, okay, what if disposable income was equal to 3,000? What would the level of savings or dissavings be? Is it positive or negative? Well, you could find the value in a similar way that we just did, or if the question simply asked, find the break-even level, and then at this current level of disposable income, would I have savings or dissavings? Well, we know that if we're looking at that break-even level, any disposable income above that, the actual consumption is going to be less than our current level of disposable income, in which case, if savings is our disposable income minus our actual consumption, if our disposable income is greater, we would have positive levels of savings. Okay. So, kind of some different variations of this question that you could be asked, kind of all related to the same concept. This is how we would kind of go through and solve it. Okay. And this looks kind of similar to question 7, right? A little bit. So we'll kind of go through question 7 next using this idea because I think it's just phrased in a slightly different way, so it might make it a little bit trickier. So let's say instead, I've got this set up and I've got disposable income, consumption, my 45-degree line, and here's like actual consumption. I'm telling you the break-even level is 4,000. Okay. If I have here that, what is it? Disposable income, or no, consumers expect higher future income. So if they expect higher future income, they're going to consume more today because they believe that they'll be able to kind of make more money in the future. They don't have to save as much. Okay. So if we're thinking about the actual level of consumption goes up at every single level of disposable income because people are spending more today because they think they're going to have more money in the future, right? Or think about it, is this really what happens when we have higher expected income? Is essentially our marginal propensity to consume is going to go up, right? In which case, if we think about that break-even level, we were taking kind of autonomous consumption divided by 1 minus marginal propensity to consume. So if this goes up, our denominator goes down, the whole fraction goes up, and that break-even level should be higher than before. We don't know what it is because we weren't given any numbers, but it would be something that's greater than. So if I'm looking at the same level of disposable income as that break-even point, what's now going to be true? Well, before I had 0 savings, that was the break-even level. Now I'm thinking about the level of disposable income. I'm saying, what if that was the same? So this is like 4,000. What if instead I'm comparing that to my actual consumption out? Well, I know it has to be something greater. I'm just going to using a hypothetical value here. So we don't know what it's going to be, but it's going to be something above 4,000. So now when we're thinking about our level of savings, that's our level of disposable income minus actual consumption. Well, my actual consumption is greater. My savings should be less than 0, or I could think about it with some hypothetical values. All right. Sure enough, this is something that's less than 0, or I have dissavings. What if instead, the second part of the question says if business taxes increase, right? So I've got negative savings, dissavings. If business taxes increase, right, what's going to happen at that old level of disposable income? Well, if business taxes increase, right, companies have less available funds to invest into projects. Essentially, we could think about our I, right? How are we kind of calculating kind of these consumption levels? It was C plus I plus G plus NX. Well, essentially, imports. Investment's going to be going down. So I got to think about it. Here's like my new actual consumption for that second part of the question. So what's going to be true now? My break-even point is going to be something less than it was before. So if I think about now, I would kind of have my level of savings being equal to 0 be somewhere down here. But if I'm comparing at the old disposable income, just like we did in the first part, now that current level of consumption compared to, you can think about this as potential consumption, what it could be. Well, now, if I'm thinking about savings, it's my disposable income minus the actual consumption. Now that actual, excuse me, that actual level of GDP, which is 4,000, compared to the actual consumption. So just put a value to it. We can think about like 3,000 here. Well, now 4,000 minus 3,000, or essentially, we know the actual consumption is less than disposable income. So we should have something that's positive using those hypothetical values. Sure enough, we see it's 1,000 now or greater than zero. So kind of shifts in that actual consumption function or what's currently being, our current expenditures, we could see shifts in that because of consumption. We could see shifts because of investments in the fiscal capital, government spending, or net exports. And then kind of there, whether or not savings is positive or negative, I can kind of think about at that same level of disposable income, what has now happened to savings, right? That would have to give you that like assumption, like assume you're still looking at that same old break-even level of consumption. Okay. Excuse me. Let me think if there's another one we can kind of work through here. That would be kind of tricky. Um, Let me see. Soon taxes decrease. The change will be what? Blah, blah, blah. Okay. So let's do 9 and 10. Um, and we'll think about here. I might combine this into 11, but so I've got consumption is equal to what? And here I'm just going to use the same equation for both. This looks a little bit different than the practice problems, but we're going to have this here. Now, I could always put autonomous consumption first. That's just kind of, we're rewriting the function in a different way. Nothing's going to kind of change for us here. Okay. So let's think about if this was our consumption function, and we know that our disposable income is going to be our actual income minus taxes. Okay. So if that's the case here, we could kind of plug that into our consumption function. Now, this one is asking you what's the change in real GDP or our equilibrium level of GDP if imports go up, and then the second question was if taxes go down. Okay. So what we're thinking about here is when I solved, and I was saying, okay, let's assume we're spending all of our disposable income. That would be C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. So when we rearrange this equation, we had that break-even level, right? We plugged in our consumption function, kind of rearranged so that we were solving for that equilibrium break-even level of disposable income. What we'd be left with was our autonomous consumption plus investment in capital, government expenditures, exports minus imports. Okay. And then we divided by 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. Now here, I didn't plug in taxes. Okay. So for right now, I'm just going to think about imports, and then I would show you what happens if we had taxes. So here we said, well, notice what's our change in this break-even level of disposable income or real GDP when we see a change in imports. So if I'm taking a derivative of this function in respect to imports, I've got negative 1 over 1 minus my marginal propensity to consume. So this is the change that occurs in that break-even real level of GDP anytime imports goes up by 1. Now, our imports in this question are going up by 360. So if imports go up by, oh, sorry, I might have said 350, 360, well, we know that every dollar will decrease that break-even level by 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So here this would be negative 360 times 1 over 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume was 0.8, right? So I got what? I think 5, so 360 times 1 over 1 minus 0.8. So I should get 1,800 if I'm doing math in my head correct here. Okay. So when imports go down, right, that was actually, can I think about if imports were to go down, I'm subtracting a smaller number, that break-even level should be higher than it was before, right? Or I'm seeing this kind of positive, um, or sorry, I have a negative value here, right? That kind of change would be that it's going, oh yeah, sorry, because I said imports were not going down. Sorry, they were going up in this question, right? So they're going up by 360. So I actually get that real level should be falling because, sorry about that, I read the question wrong. Real imports were increasing, not decreasing, which lowers that kind of level of real GDP. If the reverse was true, we had, how I originally wrote it, if imports were going down, then that kind of would be the opposite effect, right? It wouldn't decrease that break-even level of GDP, it would actually increase it. Okay. Now, a similar kind of question is instead if we're looking at taxes, okay? So if we have taxes, we said we have really the same function to solve for this break-even level. So it didn't look any different, except for when we were rearranging things, we now had in this consumption function, this was zero point 0.8 times the level of income minus taxes. So we're left with here, we now have this in the numerator when we like kind of resolve this in the general form. So now I can think about what's the effect on that break-even level of real GDP if I see a change in taxes. Well, it's kind of similar to imports. I have to remember I've got a negative value. So here I've got taking derivative in respect to taxes, I've got negative the marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So notice before, every dollar spent on imports, right, decreased our break-even level of GDP by a factor of 5. Now, if I plug this in, I've got what? 0.8 over 1 minus 0.8. Now that factor is only going to be 4. So for every dollar increase, so I think here I've got the reverse being true, I have actually a tax decrease. So for every dollar less spent on taxes, and I forgot here I've got this negative sign. Well, if every dollar spent on taxes decreases that break-even level by 4, every decrease in taxes would increase it by 4. So if here I have negative 300, taxes fall by 300, real GDP would fall by negative 300 times this kind of factor here, which was negative, we plugged our values in 4. So here that would actually increase, a decrease in taxes would actually increase our break-even level by 1,200. So it's a little bit tricky when we're dealing with imports and taxes because we have to remember there's always a negative sign out front. Every dollar increase would lower that break-even level of GDP. Every dollar decrease would increase that real level of GDP. Okay. Let me think if there's anything else I want to say here. So I don't think I did this. I don't do something like this in the quiz, but this could be fair game for the exam. So I want to think about this here. Um, so let's say, keep this to the side for a second. Let's say we didn't have taxes. Okay. So if we didn't have taxes, and maybe I give you an example where I first ask you to solve for that break-even level. So this is kind of combining two questions into one. So I've got consumption is equal to my disposable income, this 45-degree line. We have our actual consumption function. And maybe you either solve for this or you find, I give you this assumed true value, which is, I don't know, let's just say 5,000 for right now. Okay. If taxes go down, right? So in this example, like we could think about what is my kind of real level of GDP? It was C plus I plus G, and we'll just do net exports here. And then we can kind of think about here, we've got autonomous consumption plus marginal propensity to consume. But now when we factor in taxes, we had something that looked like this. So if we had a decrease in taxes, like the similar problem, right? So if I lower taxes, I'm subtracting a smaller amount that should increase that real level of GDP I'm looking at or increase that actual consumption. However, if I'm moving from this point, when taxes go down, there's more disposable income left, or the potential consumption is also higher. So the fact that potential income is higher, if we were spending all of that, we'd be on that 45-degree line. But we're not, right? When we get some of those taxes back, we don't spend all of them. We only spend whatever our marginal propensity to consume is. So when I have a decrease in taxes, essentially that's increasing kind of this actual level of consumption. Okay. So my new break-even point is going to be something higher than before. In fact, if I had those actual values, I know it's going to be 1,200 higher. So in this case, this is the new break-even point when savings is equal to zero, right? Consumption, actual consumption is equal to my disposable income. So if I instead told you, okay, find the new break-even level with taxes, what's going to be true if well, if I'm looking at that old break-even level, disposable income is still on that point where disposable income was equal to consumption. But now my actual consumption, after I'm factoring in this tax change or tax decrease here, actual consumption is now going to be higher. So we said savings is my level of disposable income minus actual consumption. If my actual consumption is greater than my disposable income, this fraction is now going to, or sorry, this equation is now going to be less than zero, or I have dissavings. Okay. So this is kind of thinking about going from a situation where we didn't have taxes to one where we did. Um, Increases in taxes would have the exact opposite effect. We kind of shift our consumption function down. But because we had a decrease in taxes, like in problem 10, that actually increases our actual consumption function, or yeah, consumption function than our kind of actual kind of expenditures, making the old level now lead to a level of dissavings because the new break-even level has to be higher. Okay. So that's kind of a set of questions, mainly using the functions, right, for consumption, thinking about introducing taxes, how would things change from imports changing or investment into physical capital changing. I'll focus on some of the other questions as we cover them in class on Monday, and then do some review. Hopefully on Thursday, people have some more questions about the material that we covered this week from Module 7 and Module 8.